Okay, so the game here is the Conquistadors. Now, I have an interesting history with this, and I may be mistaken about some things. A long time back, and this is part of mixed ideas with it, right? Part of I think it was John Southard, who's the designer of this, was working with another company to do a reinvention, really, a modernization of the old SPI Conquistador. And one of the things that kept me away from this was I had played a playtest version of that. It had some interesting ideas to it. There's no question about that. It was using cards, and it had some mechanisms. It had strayed quite far from the old game, right? But still had that same basic concept. Now, the reason I say I'm not sure if it is the designer or not, I'm face blind, and I can't be certain, but I think it was. It was someone prominent who looks kind of like him in shape, working. Anyway, I had played a playtest with that. I was interested in it, had been kind of told, hey, we'll send you a review copy when we get it out. This was from a different company, not Compass. And, that was kind of I'm usually kind of negative on not wanting to pick something up if I had been told I'd get a review copy and then I'm not going to get one, But also, do I really need something? It had some intriguing different mechanisms in it, but it was handling the same scope of storyline and the same kind of attacks, although I think it fixed some of the errors of Conquistador, so I was very interested in playing that. I think that went nowhere. There were issues behind it. And I think that didn't end up getting published at all. But when I saw this, I kind of shied away from it for that little kind of bad taste of, I was supposed to get a copy of this. This is not that game. This is a game that is more influenced by a couple of things I can think of, one of which I've covered and one of which I really should but haven't. The one that I've covered is Age of Exploration by Tim Jim Games, which has this incredibly cumbersome combination of rules, and the way they're presented is very bad, and the system is basically a multiplayer solitaire system with a little bit of potential for interfering with each other. The other game is similar to that, but it's just got these different systems that cover both the exploration side and the conquistador side, and it really gave short shift to the conquest of the empires. It felt like they were just this sort of mechanistic type device in play that really didn't appeal to me too much. And the description of this, and this is why I picked it up when I saw it on sale, is I gave it another read, and I'm like, this doesn't sound like the same game. It sounds like, if it is, they've added so much different to the one that I had play-tested once, not play-tested, but played pre-production. I call it play-testing, but it really isn't, although people, give my opinions as they do. But it's kind of nice. It's one of the nice things about cons, is being able to see what's coming up, Anyway, what was I going to say? So I thought that was kind of a hole. The other game that this kind of reminds me of a little bit is, well, there's actually two more, but the other one that it does kind of in spirit is Source of the Nile. Now, unlike Source of the Nile, you're not drawing on the map or anything, and you're not generating terrain based on the terrain that you see. But that makes some more sense here. The heart of Africa was really kind of unknown, so exploring that is of more interest. But here, you're leading a small expedition, and you're coping with the natives and whatnot. However, again, you're in the age of conquistadors, not merely in the age of exploring the dark continent, or whatever you want to say. So you're looking at not carrying a few Ascaris who might deal with a village, but you're talking about an actual, military adventure with real troops and whatnot. You're not worried so much about how many canoes and how much food and whatever you're carrying. Things are more abstracted on that side. But there's the possibility to actually, engage and sort of the heart of the game is about engaging in the sort of diplomacy and military activity that a Cortes or Pizarro is famous for. It's not the only thing you can do in the game. However, it's where most of the points seem to lie. Now, there's one other game I want to give a call out to. Maybe there's supposed to be shout outs or whatever. I don't know. I can't keep the two between each other. One way or another, somebody ends up on a knife. Which is because of the way the cards are used and the way that the players interact with one another, it kind of reminds me of another Berg game, actually, Geronimo. Geronimo is a game where you're controlling, certain, I guess, tribes, but sometimes they're nations, whatever, natives in the push westward by the U.S. And one player each turn is playing the U.S. And that's got a weird sort of switching who you control each turn dynamic. This doesn't really have much of the feel of that, but it does have, you have a handful of cards that you're trying to operate, and choose between using your own pieces and throwing hindrances at your opponent. The difference is everybody's kind of in the same boat in this. Not literally. They get onto different boats to go to different places. Everybody's just a conquistador trying to largely get gold, but maybe some exploration goals, etc. I guess the part that kind of that links it to that is the idea of playing cards against other people in a multiplayer type of game, where not all the cards are useful for yourself, right? Some of them are reactions that you want to play against other people instead of for yourself. You do have a little bit of sort of hand selection in this game, nothing like deck manipulation or anything like that. I mean, I guess maybe at some level there is, but and we'll get to that if I see any. But you get to draw a handful of cards at the beginning of each turn and then discard a few. But before you draw your handful, you get to discard as many as you like. So, if you got bad cards last turn that you couldn't use and you don't think you're going to be able to use them again, you discard them. Let's take a look at the components, which are of some interest here. So there's two maps, and you can use either or both depending on the number of players. I know in 2 players you only use one map. The game holds up to 5. I think in 3 you're still on one map, but I'm not positive of that. But the idea is you've got 2 different sections of South America that during this period, had empires in them that could be exploited and, manipulated in such a way to provide gold and whatnot. The actual spaces on the board are numbered to indicate how likely it is to discover something in that space. A 0 is not going to discover much. 4 is where the imperial territory cities show up. You've got these L's and R's. L's are legendary spaces. You can see these legendary spaces are kind of separated from everything else by desert. Over here, there's a couple that are kind of easier to reach, although they're far, as well as here, although they're kind of far from the Cuba entranceway, as opposed to down here. Whereas up here, Panama's the only entrance. Panama can be used on either map as a colonial base that you send your Conquistador explorers out of. And here you have rainforest spaces, which, like the deserts, provide you with a barrier to getting to those legendary spaces. Those legendary spaces are sort of an optional rule. The game is divided into two types of rules: basic rules and standard rules. I didn't want to do basic and advanced. I think the impression is the standard game is the one you really should be playing. So that's what we're going to be looking at. The basic game is kind of more of a quick start, and it has a few less details in it. It's not really that significantly different, though. It's not like a whole bunch of rules are withdrawn. There's, it's more like scenario instructions for it. You have a bunch of tracks. So the game is going to proceed in impulses, in the sense that, like with a CDG or like with something like Europa Universalis or whatever, each turn forms a framing around a set of impulses, each of which allows you to basically do one action. There's a couple of, there's other things that can happen during the impulse, play of cards, etc. And some actions can lead into another thing that you do, or other options. Let's see. The records tracks are basically general records tracks. Now, if you don't have, if you're playing just one board, you don't have the card spaces on this board, and you don't have the impulse track or the governor favor track on this board. So you kind of need to have both boards around, or make some little paper tracks as ancillary things. Now, I've given this a little bit of a play. I played through the first couple turns. I was about to play the third turn, but I'm like, well, something nasty happens in the third turn that I didn't really want to deal with. So I didn't get a really deep view of the game yet, but I got some of the basic mechanisms down, which, when you're facing a new kind of system, and this, is really kind of not exactly like anything else out there. It's not all that different, but the rules as written don't always make as much sense. You're not sure how you're going to manipulate them in actual play. Things like, the game is fairly reliant on charts and tables. Things like the interactions of those might have some big surprises that hit you first thing when you first start playing the game. So it kind of, the first time you play it, you almost have to be looking at it as a learning game. Now, for me, the best way to do that is a little bit before I come on the video. And that's enough that I think I could bring this game to someone and play it opposed. But personally, I kind of don't feel like I learn a game at all when I'm playing opposed. That's just more of a social experience. Anyway, by the way, there are solitaire rules as well for this, which is important because it's almost a solitaire game. But, so consider, like Source of the Nile or Age of Exploration, both of which are sort of these multiplayer solitaires. This is kind of like that, but the difference is with these strategy cards, the fact that a significant number of them allow you to interfere with other players. So the main focus of the solitaire rules, which I'm not going to go into, is constructing an opponent deck that's going to be cards played against you. I didn't look heavily at them. For pieces, if we hit everything, we haven't hit the governor's track. So the governor's track is going to provide, there's some modifiers on how well certain die rolls and whatnot work because of the governor in terms of raising funds or something like that. There's a core victory point value to making friends with the governor, and you do this by giving him gold. However, you can also influence governors to be against other players, and that can be useful because if you get them down below 0, you can play a warrant for their arrest. This was done against both Cortez and Balboa, and send one of your own expeditions out to seize them. Now, if you remember anything about, I can't remember the book, but was it Conquest of Mexico? Maybe. The Cortez situation, he basically convinced his arrestor to join him. So, all right. You also have troops, which will be carrying... Oh, I haven't gone into this. Each conquistador handled in the game has a card. Now, these are kind of problematic, and I'll tell you why. They also have a counter to represent them. The red-bordered counters are the starting conquistadors. They're the ones each player selects their first conquistador from. The brown-bordered conquistadors are, when combined with any remaining red-bordered ones, if necessary, only necessary if there's enough players that you need to do this, are also kind of starting. They're your secondary set. And, you know, the best guys are in the red borders. I don't know if there are any brown borders that compete with them. But here's the problem. These cards, which are what you're going to be looking at, don't have any indication of color on them. They don't indicate which border they're on there. Now, Compass has had an issue with this, of constructing games where the components are lacking, you know, useful information, or it's hard to discern, or sometimes really weird color schemes. I'm trying to remember the one, the World War I one, which I've got to have up here somewhere. Oh, it's got to be hiding there somewhere. Oh, Balance of Power there with its weird pink units and everything. At least they're highly distinguishable. But anyway, almost every Compass game I see has some kind of component issue where the graphic design has like gone off the rails. Here, they missed an important facet, and there's really no way of distinguishing these except what you do. You know, they could shade them with red or brown, depending. They don't. They're just all sort of the same. What they actually do, the only way to do it is to go through the list of red ones and sort them out from the brown ones. Because the red ones are all that's available as your first pick, and then the brown ones get thrown in if they will be needed. Okay. So that's the Conquistadors. And a party can must have a Conquistador, but it can consist of more than one. Now, if you lose your Conquistador and you don't have a spare kicking around, there's these replacement Conquistadors who are basically an infinite deck of really lesser valued people, but they will take a position, you know, if something horrible happens and you lose one of your good ones. Their values are significantly different, and this is going to be a serious situation, instance of some sort of unbalance in the game. Now, the multiplayer situation and the opposition card play and whatever may negate that. You know, it may allow the players to basically mitigate any kind of effects that higher quality, better Conquistadors are going to have. You're going to hit them with harder stuff, harder problems. Okay. Each Conquistador set has a set of each player set has a set of counters, which are going to represent different things. Stuff for the records track, the amount of money, the amount of victory points you have, any debt that you've accumulated in the standard game, and then any cities allied to you that you've found on the board. Okay. And there are, I've popped out 2 there. And here are 3 more. 3 more sets. So that's the 5 players. I have to say the coloring between these 2 is pretty close to each other. And that's going to be kind of problematic. Want to keep those two players kind of on different maps or something if they both have to play. Again, that compass, the graphic design, I mean, the map is pretty and it's functional. It's hard to understand the errors that creep in. There's somebody who really knew what they were doing in a lot of ways here, and then, they do this where that's not the worst, though, and we'll get to the worst in a moment. All right. So anyway, on your Conquistador card for your expedition, you buy and assign various troops at the beginning of the game, and whenever a Conquistador comes into play, they come in with more troops. They show up, except for the replacements. They show up with more forces, and you have multiple different choices of where to put them when you get a reinforcement. So you've got cavalry, which are exceedingly effective against the natives. You've got infantry who aren't all that impressive. The actual guns were so slow firing, etc., that other than a morale effect, they weren't that important. What was more important were artillery pieces, not because necessarily their effect, but they boomed so loud and could knock down a bunch of people at once. The horses, which were just, an amazing impact. And something that's not represented here, which was the Spanish war dogs were actually pretty damn important to their fighting as well, towards scaring the natives. Oh, okay, let me keep going with components, but there's something important I wanted to go into that I found out in the designer's notes that just really, really intrigued me. Food, obviously, expeditions need food. This is represented as at the end of each turn, you're going to need to eat a food in general, depending on where you are. But you only pick up the food from the natives because under the course of a turn, you're moving around, taking your impulse actions and whatever. That'll wear out whatever food you brought with you on the expedition. So you kind of have a free food. You're fed when you land on the map, but okay. Gold, which is sort of your main goal in the game for victory points. This is the main way you're going to get your victory points. And so in the basic game, you can just exchange gold and turn it into victory points. Or, in the standard game, you can use your gold to bribe governors. I think you can turn it into pesos, or you can divide the gold. And there's a mechanism for dividing the gold that doesn't turn directly into victory points. Instead, though, it generates a share of victory points, and it kind of depends on the size of your force. The bigger your force, the less victory points you get per gold that you pull in, which is kind of a neat mechanism. The other one, in the basic game, whatever gold you capture, you can just turn into victory points. What's odd is you can do this anywhere at any time, not at any time, but anywhere on the board, which feels a little weird, but okay. You got some markers to indicate, how much you've plundered or begged for gold from natives. You got some other markers here. These are combat markers to indicate that your troops have taken some morale hits. Well, not just combat. Combat and environmental markers. And eventually they collect up and they'll lose you a piece. You have these mosquitoes, which tend to show up in the low-valued areas. They're a health hazard if you end your turn in them. You have discovered markers, which are, I discovered nothing. In the space. Most spaces will all spaces when you encounter them will have a counter on them once you've encountered it. And that could be a village, town, or city, an imperial city, or mosquitoes, or a discovered marker. Okay, and the discovered markers are just to indicate, yeah, we've already looked here. Now, there's possibilities that discoveries can be, that the discovered or mosquito can be removed, and you can look again in that space, apparently from the strategy cards. Okay, the final thing is, each empire in the game and they're not named. But you can find these in the New World. They have a set of 3 cities, one of which is a capital. They have a king, and there's rules to differentiate them from the normal cities, whatever, how you operate in terms of interacting with these, with the primary goal getting more gold, but also keeping yourself alive. Now, here's where we get into the biggest of the counter problems. These are 2 different empires. Yeah, there's a little bit of a difference, barely noticeable. This one, at least it's not as yellow, but there's just these little tiny variations between yellow and green in these 2. I mean, I can't tell these 2 apart. Yeah, they would trivially get messed up. Worse, the normal cities are almost exactly the same. Indeed, here, I can't tell these 2 apart. Just can't. And I can barely tell these 2 apart. I mean, it's just, this is really troubling. I don't know, you know, what kind of color proofs, etc., were given out that, and I'm assuming my eyes aren't that much worse than most people's in terms of, you know, I have some trouble with blue-green differentiations. Very, very mild. But yeah, I think I'm at the point where I have to, if I want to play this game, I have to mark some of these up. And if I'm going to do that, I might as well mark up the cards too, right? With some kind of indication of the of which deck they belong in. These are things that should have been done initially before the game, you know, before the game was published, really. But I guess maybe you could say, well, the proofs look different than, you know, significantly different than what was actually printed or whatever. I don't know. But whatever the decision was, I mean, any kind of proof, there's just only so much space in that green-yellow range that you could have gotten away with this. So unless you like, this one is, I'm sorry, not those. This one is moderately easy to distinguish, blue. The purple one is pretty easy to distinguish. The other 3 are all pretty much the same color to me. Close enough, and they are worse than that, the same color as sort of the net things. Each city also has a hostile version, well, each place, on the side of it. Now, we're going to hit something in the rules where you flip over Spanish units and native units. And the Spanish units have nothing on the other side. Native units that have nothing on the other side are destroyed. But there's others that do have something on the other side, which indicate that they can be weakened. But the Spanish units can all be flipped over in combat and really should have like something printed on that other side, especially since there's already, you know, it's not like it's a white-backed counter or something that, you know, double-sided printing wasn't used. Double-sided printing was used on this. There should be some indication. It probably shouldn't be the exact same picture as on here, but it should be close because they have the same strength factor on them. Again, that's a pretty minor point. You can work around that, although it's annoying if you have, you know, infantry and cav both flipped over in a space, and you can't distinguish them anymore. You know, that's kind of irritating. Those units unflip at the end of a combat, so it's not that big a deal, but it's obnoxious in general, at least. Let's see what else you got. You got the player aids here. Let me swap batteries. There's 2 copies of each of these player aids, which seems sufficient. And they give you This gives you the general of discovery. This is handling diplomacy actions, which we'll talk about for all combat. Collecting up funds and building new units when you bring a new conquistador in, giving gifts to the governor. At least one thing was problematic here. The diplomacy table says roll 1d6. I believe that's an error. There's errata out there. Well, there's two sets of errata. There's printed errata that came with the game, which doesn't cover with everything, which doesn't cover much of anything that was too problematic, except these spaces, which is kind of weird. I'll get to that in a moment, or I'll get to that when I go over the errata. I didn't look at the online errata. It's in a PDF. I don't feel like digging through that. I don't feel like I have many questions, so I'm okay with it. But the one question I did have was this roll 1d6 on a table that looks like it really should be 2 dice because it goes up to 15, maybe even 3. Well, the rules say roll 2d6. I'm like, okay, cool with that, because it's almost impossible to get anything through diplomacy, which would really, really weaken Cortez. Over here, something I haven't dealt with at all, which is when you get into a space with a legend, you get to make a roll and see what you find. And this whole section I haven't dealt with, except the random events table. At the beginning of each turn, and remember, there aren't a lot of turns. Well, turns are rather large objects, okay? There's a fair number of impulses, kind of like in an EU type game. You start at impulse 1. I may have started at 0, cheating and creating things a little too fast. And then starting on impulse 3, you start getting a 2 dice roll that will end the impulse at the end of that, end the turn at the end of that impulse, or end the set of impulses. You still have a little bit more turn to play, some maintenance and whatnot. An action you might take is rally. That's to remove morale hits. Sometimes you might have to take a morale check table because you're sitting in malaria or something like that, or you're out of food. When you actually plunder, plundering is going to piss off the natives very quickly, but it'll get you your gold more quickly. If you've already got pissed off natives and you've wiped out their army, might as well plunder them, I guess, because it's going to be hard to get the gold from them otherwise. Right? But plundering can get it more rapidly. And I guess that's about it there. Now, in my playthrough, I played only 2 characters. I'm going to do 4 this time, which is going to be a little problematic. I admit that right off the bat. Because there's a lot of interactivity with these cards in terms of, oh, somebody did that? Oh, yeah, well, that's going to hit them and make it bad. The problem is in a 2-player game, all your reactions, all your nastiness is going to go to the other player. You're just going to screw the other player over as much as you want. Whereas in more, and I think I'm going to go with 4 just for nice balance, even though 5 works. With a larger set of players, you have to consider, whom do I really want to hit with this nastiness? Oh, something I didn't mention. I mean, I did in passing. There's a couple of natives in here, and whenever natives are needed for troops, you just draw them out of here. They go back in if defeated or otherwise removed from the map. Okay, so yeah. So one more thing in kind of the intro. Then I'm going to go to the rules kind of explanation side of things, which is a little one thing that's notably missing from the game is a sequence of play. Sequence of play is in the rule book, but there's not a separate one on any of the sheets. I wrote my own up. Somebody's created one as a player aid. that's probably too heavy-handed for my taste. Using just a simple, you know, index card or whatever. I'm able to get the major things here. It's honestly not that big a deal. I found myself looking at the rules anyway because I needed the extra information there, at least at the beginning. All right. So, to the last thing that I wanted to hit in terms of just me babbling without going into... I'll give an overview of the rules before I dig into them, because the rule book itself is somewhat difficult to cope with. Okay. But before I do that, the designer indicated, you know, sometime around 1990, he's been having this idea of something really focused on the Conquistador element of the game. And what's kind of odd to me, right about that same period, and maybe it's for me, it may be because I had played Age of Exploration once and kind of saw that mechanism and didn't quite understand what was going on with it. I went exploring instead. And we didn't play very long, but I was intrigued by it there. I remembered, you know, things like Conquistador or, if kicking over here, New World, which I really ought to play, but God, I hate those. The rules are horrible in that. It's a period of Avalon Hill rules. I don't know, it's like Siege of Jerusalem and Republic of Rome and stuff like that. They're written in that sort of facet. Very Don Greenwood, one of his worst ways, and he's found so many bad ways to write rules. Anyway, I found it kind of funny that just about the same time as I was playing around with kind of a similar idea to this. Now, the one that I was thinking of was more of a solo game design, although there's, you know, an aspect to this that's solo, multiple player solo with interference, right? But was really kind of based on trying to mimic some of the intriguing aspects of Cortez's expedition. I feel like I was going into more detail on a few things, more detail on the military side, more detail on the, you know, in concept, not that I got anything that was working down. More detail on the diplomacy and the interactions of the different cities. You know, this has diplomacy, this has combat. It hits those points, but it doesn't hit the same kind of detail of, hey, what happens if you fight, you know, this village? Does that cause diplomatic issues with other villages? In which direction? Stuff like that. Where I was really trying to make some projections and, you know, a game out of it, but one that was trying to expose a theory that I had at the time, one that I probably can't even elucidate at this point. But anyway, yeah, so, you know, some of me is kind of like, I wonder what kicked off that, you know. Was it Age of Exploration? Did he see that and say, you know, this could be done so much better somehow? Okay. So let me briefly look at the sequence of play, tell you what happens in that, and then do a deeper dive into the rules to look for specifics. And some of those specifics might be... Okay. So the first thing you do is you set up the game. Duh. And the setup of the game involves sorting these cards into the red deck. Each player rolls for initiative, checks to see, picks, whoever gets the best initiative, picks the explorer or conquistador of their choice out of the red deck, out of the remaining ones. And they're going to place them either at Santiago de Cuba or at one of the two Panama spaces. And you can actually transition between boards through the Panama space. That's important. Okay. Then, in the basic game, you go through some kind of thing that allows you to pick a couple of locations on the board, a couple of villages, a town, and you place your stuff there, and you just start, you know, on the board, partially exploring already. Let's ignore that, because the standard game is the standard game, right? In the standard game, what you do instead is you're going to start in one of these locations, and you roll on the funds table for the initial setup, 1 die, plus the governor's modifier, which is nothing, plus possible card bonuses or something that might be there. I think there are some cards that affect this. But you will have no cards, and the governor's modifier will be 0 at the beginning, so I don't know why there's a 7 or plus on initial setup. You could give somebody a +1. That gives you an amount of money. That's an amount of money that you can double by taking out a loan. So, you know, let's say I got 16 bucks. I could take 16 pesos here, and then I could take up to another 16 in debt to get myself up to 32 pesos to expend. So you got this kind of balancing, hey, how big a force do you want to build? It's hard to tell when you first play. What you pay for is each horse costs 4. You're only allowed up to 3 of them on any given turn per player. Each cannon costs 3. There's not much reason to buy more than 1 cannon. I mean, maybe a card will screw your cannon up or something. And then each foot costs 2. Now remember, the bigger your expedition, the more money, the more you're going into debt, and debt has to be paid off. It counts against your victory. And the more, each time you find gold, and well, each time you divide gold, the less points that you get from that gold. The more troops you have, the less points you're going to get out of the gold. Now, we'll get to the rules on that when we look at the details there, but that's a key issue to consider. My battery's not working. Okay. And then you set your Conquistador counter on one of those starting spaces, whichever one you want to start on. It's kind of hard to tell. Like, it seems obvious, oh, I can start exploring right away from here, whereas from here, well, maybe not. Well, that's not really the case, because you're going to be allowed to move by sea and land right here in the Yucatan pretty easily as a beginning thing. Over on this side, you're not allowed to land on the sea here until game turn 3. This is misstated, and that's in the errata. What's weird is that's the Mar del Sur. This is also the Mar del Sur. It's not marked with that. I don't know how much you'd need to use boat. I don't know how much people are going to be using boats on the Mar del Sur from here, but it's not clear whether or not you're allowed to. I think you're allowed to sail through these and these, just not the spaces that are marked against it. But the one place, well, the places where it's mentioned in the rules and in the errata don't specify, well, the errata kind of hints it, that these spaces are actually marked. I think. I know the errata kind of specifies it. The rules might as well. So let's not be too. Okay. The core of the game, though, and there it goes again. It should be red. For each game turn, first thing you're allowed to do is discard as many strategy cards as you like. Now, it says they're discarded without revealing them. I think that just means you slip them onto the bottom of the deck. Early on, discards, and there are going to be some are going to be visible. You might hide them by flipping the top one over temporarily or something. Then everybody gets 10 strategy cards as their hand. They don't draw 10 new ones. Their hand fills up to 10. And then they can discard 2 more. Well, they must discard 2 more. So they're going to have 8 cards in their hand at the beginning of each turn. Then you roll for initiative. this is going to create a player order that's not sequential around the board. There are no markers to indicate who goes first, who goes second, and whatnot. You could use dice for this. You could grab additional allied cities, and because there's probably more than you need, especially if you've got a lot of players, and sequence them out so that you know the order that players are going to be handling their impulses for that turn. Completely random there. Then, starting on game turn 2, there's a potential random event. You just roll on here and see what happens. And hey, good, bad stuff, whatever. Okay, then you go to the actual impulses. And the basic concept with the impulse is you can do one thing and then some other stuff. You can do one thing with one of your Conquistador stacks. And that's basically activating an expedition. And it's got a fair amount of choices of what it can do. It can try moving and exploring. It can try doing diplomacy. It can do a battle. But basically, you're going to get to do one thing. The more stacks you have, the more competition for that one thing you want to do. Just keep that in mind. Or you can use a hostile Indian stack on the board to interfere with somebody else's Conquistadors. In addition, you're allowed to play as many strategic cards as you want. You can divide gold, which gets you victory points, might get you governor's favor, etc. You can gift the governor. Yeah, I think that's where you get governor's favor. Okay. And you keep cycling through the impulses, each player in turn, in the turn's player order, getting their single action, and then all these ancillary things they can do. Most of which you won't do, but you might play some strategic cards, or strategy cards, in most turns. Okay, after the impulses run out due to these die rolls, and I guess on impulse 7, you just keep rolling for 2 through 7, or 2 through 10. There it goes again, damn it. During the rules, the intro section, because I'm talking so much, and it will be during the early play too, certainly, that, I'm eating up a lot of battery. This camera eats battery like mad, and I need that reserve battery to fill up. I've got an extra reserve, but then that causes problems with loading if I use more than 2 batteries. Okay. You hit a subsistence phase, where you have to check to see that everybody has food. Now, you can get food automatically by being in one of the key areas, or being, I think it's even adjacent to a friendly town or city. So, or certainly being in it. The natives will feed you if you're there. But otherwise, you're going to have to spend some of your effort towards getting food, which the only way you can do that is by doing diplomacy with the natives. You're not going to be able to hunt for enough food. And that makes sense. If you think about it, you need things like oils and grains and stuff. You can't just live off of berries and meat, because your diet's not used to that. Okay, and then there's a malaria check, which is if you're in a mosquito space or in a rainforest space, you take a morale potential hit. Then you see if you've won the game. There's a fixed victory point total, and that can be negotiated beforehand or whatever. They give suggestions for it. And then any plunder and gold roll markers are removed. Now, not the plunder outs. They indicate the city is completely wiped out. But plunder attempts and gold rolls, the more attempts at plundering or begging for gold that you make, the harder the next attempts that turn are going to be. But each turn that resets. That's the core flavor of the game. Now, I'm going to take the rest of the video, more or less, to kind of go through the rules. I don't think I'm going to read through the rules like I often do, because I am fairly comfortable with most of it, but And I think I've given you a base overview here. But there's mechanical aspects that really we do have to go into, like the aspect of how discovery is performed. You know, you move into a space that you haven't searched before. You have a certain movement allowance, but as soon as you enter an unexplored space, you have to check for discovery, and you stop your action, that impulse. And you see what you found, and some of the implications of how that works might be of some importance. For the most part, this is going to be a pretty dull part. By the way, I should have said much earlier, the designer actually has done a kind of how to play video, so that's actually more helpful if you're looking to learn how to play the game as opposed to the context in which I'm looking at it. I haven't looked at that, so I don't know, you know, I don't know how effective it is or whatever, but I assume it's going to be better than whatever the hell I do. Let's look at some of the specifics in the rules. Before I start marking up pieces. Oh, component-wise, I forgot to mention, the game came with these dice. They look pretty good, actually, but for whatever reason, I'm gonna go with these rounded ones. Those are a little bigger than I like, and someday I have to make a video on how I choose my pairing of games and dice, because it really, there's almost an art to it, and it probably wouldn't work for anyone else. But I have these very specifics, and here I wanted slightly larger dice than I don't know, the littler ones, littler rounded colored ones that I was using with Asper Nestling. And I didn't want the kind of square Avalon Hill dice that I tend to like with older war games. And then I've got like the gamer's dice that I use for games that are maybe too glossy. Like the Avalon Hill ones go well with the matte 1970s, very early 80s views. It just, I don't know. It's weird. Okay, so each Conquistador has 3 numbers on it. Rally, which is going to be for removing morale hits. Combat, which is going to be a die roll modifier on the combat results table, and Diplomacy, which is again a die roll modifier when you perform diplomacy actions. So one thing that's a little weird, and I did explain this, but I want to hit it again because it is odd. When the only time you get new troops on the board is either through a strategy card that allows you to do it, but the basic way is when a new Conquistador comes into play. Now, wherever that Conquistador comes into play, and this felt weird to me, it makes sense, you know, if they're at one of the ports. But if they join another expedition, they join with additional troops. It's an abstraction. They've spent some time traveling to get there, so you don't have to ferry your reinforcements to your force. That doesn't mean you necessarily want to group everybody together. Remember, the more troops in a group, the less victory points you get in the standard game from that group when you divide the treasure, which is one reason I like the standard game concept better. There's these Mano da Dios cards, which allow you to either play them ahead of time for a +2 modifier to a lot of die rolls, or you can play them after the die roll and get a reroll to one of your own dice. Die rolls. If 2 dice are involved, they both go. You can only do it to your own dice. You can use up to 1 for each function. You can add 2 to the die roll, and you can re-roll the dice, keeping that +2 modifier. There's things you can't play them on. Makes sense. We talked about the sequence of play because that's what decided everything. Specific different types of strategy cards. Action cards are played during your own impulse. and they can either be played to benefit your own actions, or they have an effect on their own, and you can use as many of these as you like. Combat cards, if you're involved in a combat, you're allowed to play them, or you can play them for Indian forces, to help them against another player. You can't help one player against another with those cards. And reaction cards are generally played in an attempt to penalize something that a player is doing. Like if they move into a space, you might have an ambush or something in there. Okay. The core of the initiative segment is an expedition activation. This is, you could, so there's one thing that's the or. Activate one expedition or a hostile Indian. Activating the expedition is the standard thing you're going to be doing, unless you really, really want to hunt somebody down by using your actions for that. The other things that are done, the strategy cards, dividing gold, whatever, those are all just ancillary, and they have their own dots, but they're just kind of assumed. When you activate an expedition, you can either move, conduct combat, which might involve the movement. Movement might include discovery. Or you can do diplomacy if you're in a town or something. And I say town, I should say settlement, because you can use them in cities, towns, and villages. Perform plunder or a rally action. In the course of a turn, you're probably going to want to do at least one diplomacy to get food. And maybe other things. Once you find a nice source of gold, you're probably going to want to be doing diplomacy, plunders, and stuff like that to collect up the gold, rather than keep wandering around. Although the impulse track has a 0 marker, this is in the errata. It always starts at 1. After each player is gone, you make a roll. If you're in the right spread, the turn end, well, the impulse rounds end. Okay. For movement, overland you're allowed to go up to 2 spaces, the second of which, the last of which, they say of which the second, is an undiscovered space. When you enter an undiscovered space, when you enter an undiscovered space, then you conduct the discovery routine. Up to 3 spaces, all of which have already been discovered. And then they also put here 1 space and also make an attack in that space. That's actually the attack action, the combat action here, if you want to align them properly, but it's not a big deal. When you enter an undiscovered space, you must stop. If you enter a hostile space, you must stop. Or if you enter a space where someone else did a discovery in the same impulse, you must stop. Which is to say you can't leapfrog their discovery. There's a lot of games that allow that kind of stuff. You probably don't want to be too close to another person, because you will be competing over the same stuff when both of you would do better spread out more. And that's the thing, like in a 2-player game, there's a lot of map. There's like room for 3 players on this map. This one might be a little more crowded because of the initial boat situation. But once you get above 3 players, you probably want some of the players on different maps. But remember, each player can have multiple Conquistador stacks. That comes at a cost. One of your stacks isn't doing something, like let's say you have 2 different stacks of Conquistadors. One stack's doing something during your impulse. Well, the other stack isn't. It's just sitting there, which can seem exceedingly inefficient. But like I said, if you want to keep your divisions low, your divisors low, you may not want a lot of troops in one stack, and an additional Conquistador adds to your divisors as well. Sea movement is up to 6 spaces, and you start in either a sea space, which are the ones without numbers, or in a location that's adjacent to a sea space, and you end your turn either in a sea space or in a space adjacent to a sea space. and you cannot travel through anything but sea spaces. All right, discovery is actually pretty damn simple. It's all on the chart, but we'll look at it. We'll be seeing it in play. You'll be rolling based on the level of the space. You get a modifier. Some spaces have a -1 on them. This one has a +1. What's up with that? I don't know what's up with that. I think that maybe is supposed to be a -1, because I don't know of any definition for +1s. Let's see. Did it make it in the map errata? It's not on there. Oh well. Okay. So you roll on here. You get a -1 if there's a -1 in the space. You get a +1 if there's if somebody played an Indian ambush against you when you moved into that space. The ambush is handled first. If you survive that, you get a bonus. You're more likely to find something interesting. If there's an adjacent civilization, you get a plus, but it's not. It's a minus. Okay, so if you're trying to make a discovery at a certain level, you have to look what's adjacent to you. And if there's no settlement that you've already discovered adjacent, you might suffer a penalty, or you might get an X, which says you can't even try to discover anything in there. Let me see the definition here. Now, here's the thing. If you don't do a discovery in there, I think you still stay in the space, so you could try to squeeze across the board. It's really not what's intended in the game, but there doesn't seem to be a prohibition against that. And there might be reasons. If somebody else found something. So for example, if you're coming in this direction and you don't have a valid exploration for this space or for this space because you've got shitty rolls, but somebody else found something over here, you might want to cross over. And this kind of allows that. Again, you're just hacking your way through, and it really doesn't taste right to me. Like, it feels like if you were wandering through a heavily populated area, you would notice something. I gotta swap batteries. There are factors of why I'm handling the rules in such a light fashion on this one. Like I said, I had to play this and fiddle around with it on the board. I know a lot of people do that anyway, but with a lot of games, I don't feel like I have to do that, right? When something's an unfamiliar system, I often feel this kind of requirement to do that. But also, the rules did not give me a good feel for what the play was going to be like. I consider that a hit against the rules, but I'm not sure how possible it is for them to do that. And, you know, honestly, if it's your first CDG, not that this is a CDG, but if you're playing your first CDG, you kind of want to fiddle around with that and see, hey, how does this actually work, right? And then once you get it, every CDG, you kind of know how it's going to work. Same thing with, you know, your first standard sort of I go, you go hex encounter type game. But, you know, I've run into things where I felt like it wasn't that different a game, but I really, really needed to see, just to get an idea what sort of the core operations in the game were. So part of it is, yes, maybe the rules aren't as giving me as good an idea as I might want, and part of it is it's a new system. And they kind of mix together, and it's hard to tell which is which, right? You know, when you're familiar with the type of system, it's very, very easy to kind of absorb what's going on. Honestly, I think most of it is the new system type of thing where I was afraid that, am I missing something? You know, this doesn't seem like enough, right? And we'll see. Okay. So we've talked about the discovery for the most part, diplomacy. If you're in a space, let's see, where you have a town or city, not a village. Village can't be used for diplomacy. You can declare your main action for your expedition to be diplomacy. And you'll be rolling on here. The modifiers are listed again here in both places, plus the diplomacy rating of the individual conquistador. -3 if you're in a hostile location. Your goal in a hostile location is really to get it down to neutral, probably. Okay. -2 if the city is already, if the settlement is already allied to a different player. -1 if it's an imperial city, one of the cities that's marked here. Now, you're going to see something weird with the imperial cities. Since they can only show up in 4-point areas, it's quite likely that they're going to have intermingled with them other towns and or cities that aren't marked as imperial. I don't know, whether that represents different political structures or if it actually represents part of that empire that, and I suspect it's kind of agnostic on this, part of that empire that doesn't count as imperial. It doesn't really make a difference for the game. It's not like the empire is mustering forces, throughout its territory or anything to face you. Nothing that complicated's going on. Also, strategy cards, either the player who's taking the action or players who play reaction cards can impact you with this. Now, this is a game where I saw the rule that maybe I tried to apply to a different game, which is you can only play one of a given card for a given effect. So in a diplomacy thing, if there's 2 cards that have the same effect, this may only apply to battle, but so for example, in battle, there's something called Painted Warriors, which gives a bonus to combat. There's a fair number of them in the strategy deck. You can only play one of them to affect any single group of warriors. Okay, here it says roll 2 dice. Here it says roll 1. I'm assuming this is something in the errata. I'm going with the rules because it would be almost impossible to get any results. You would need so many fucking cards. Cortez is like +3 on the table. And you might get, so if you're facing, say, an imperial city, you're at +2. You might get +2 or +3 off cards at most. So you're looking at like +5. Your maximum is an 11 in that case, right? Maximum. And that's assuming, none of the hard situations. So 2 dice sounds reasonable. I looked at this chart and just assumed it was 2 dice. When I saw the roll 1 die, I was disturbed, to say the least. But then I looked in the rules and, hey. Okay. So you get a number of different possible effects here. Food point, hey, you get an extra food point. You just put that on your Conquistador card or next to it or whatever, however you're going to represent that. Choose allows you a gold or an asset card. A gold, I think that means a gold roll. Let me see if that... Because otherwise you couldn't get 0. Yeah, if a player chooses gold, he uses the diplomacy table. See, elsewhere in the chart it says gold roll. So that's kind of an errata issue there, which could very easily make you think you just get 1 gold for that. Or asset card. Asset card, you draw one of those. Those basically are some kind of asset that you pick up in the New World, like a native interpreter or a scout or something like that, that's going to help you. And you place them face down to begin with. I'm probably going to keep them face up just because I'm playing solo. Once they're played, they're with an expedition, and there's like this weird line here. I think it's just a marring little grease mark or something. They stay face up with that expedition and treat it. The exception to that is there's mano a dioses, which when you draw them, they are placed face up, and they're placed not with an expedition. So they're an indication that you have the hand of God in your favor. Normally you have your hand of God card. Well, a lot of the hand of God cards come from the strategy deck. I don't know how many are in the asset deck. Other options, well, if hostile, it becomes neutral. So all of these take place. Now, here it says allied city only. Okay. If you're in a city and you get this value, you get the city as an allied city, which gets marked with one of these. And that'll give you some additional benefits. They'll feed you, for example. And we'll hit the rules for alliance in a moment. And then here, the only real bonus here, well, there's a couple. Gold starts getting a plus modifier the further up you go. But also, if you're in an imperial city with the king present, you get to capture him on that one. And that can give you some benefits for obtaining gold. Now, well, let's go to the gold table. So if you choose gold rather than an asset card, now here they don't give you the option. This is weird. +2 modifier to gold roll if chosen. It's almost a you can't get. Oh, no. It's same as 11 to 14. Okay, so you get this, but the modifier goes up to +2 instead of +1, I'm assuming. Now, if you're in a town or a city, you can roll for gold. And each time that you roll for it, you put one of these gold roll markers on there. And that'll be a penalty. Those all get cleared at the end of the turn. If you have the king captive, you get a bonus. If anybody plundered the town this turn, a lot of the gold is missing now, so there's a minus there, or hidden. Imperial cities and capitals give you an immediate +1 and those will be in the city table. And then the card modifier, you might play cards that give you pluses, and some people might play ones that give you minuses. Okay. Is that it? You might get, once you form an alliance, first the city marker is replaced with an allied city marker, and that's even if it's an imperial city. If the city has combat units, I think, unless Imperial changes things when we get to it. If the city has combat units, place as many of those as you wish in your expedition. As with other type of markers, the number of allied city markers provided in the game is a design limit. You may recycle by pulling one off the map, and that's the case with all the settlements too. You could unexplore an area that way. An allied city will provide food for your expedition in the same or any adjacent space. Allied troops can be taken into your expedition and move and fight with your expedition, including against other Indian units. These troops don't count against your troop limit. There must be at least one Spanish unit with the expedition, though, in order for the expedition to exist. Otherwise, yeah. Alliance is a city allied with a specific player, whereas neutral and hostile apply to all Spanish forces. Once a city's made hostile, it's just, it's hostile to everyone until it's made neutral to everyone. And once a city's made neutral, it's not allied with anyone. A player may conduct diplomacy against a city allied with another player. All results are ignored except alliance. In the case of an alliance result, the city changes its alliance. It becomes allied with the player who performed the diplomacy action. You can conduct diplomacy with a city with which you're already allied just in hopes of getting more gold or assets. There's not a bonus for that. And if you try to plunder a city that you're allied, basically troops show up, you have to fight them, and if you're successful in fighting them, you get the plunder off. Okay. How does combat work in this game? Spanish forces can freely attack Indians that are not part of an expedition and vice versa. Spanish expeditions can attack other expeditions only as a result of arrest warrant cards, which should be strategy cards. But when an Indian unit not part of an expedition attacks or is attacked, all Indian units in the space participate. Any player may use an Indian force in any hostile city to attack an expedition in the same city. When an expedition attacks, only that expedition, including any conquistadors embedded with it, take part. Likewise, when an expedition is attacked, only its units defend. I'm reading every single rule now, which we should not do. No combat in sea, nor the starting spaces, Santiago and Panama. All right, how is combat handled? So we're going to look at the standard game combat here, which is important because it has some special rules. But the core rule is each player totals their combat factors. The combat factors are on the counters. For the Spaniards, they might be on the reverse side if you've already been hit in that battle. For the Indians, it'll be whichever side. You know, again, if the Indians are hit, they're either destroyed or flipped over and they get the weakened side. The Spanish player adds to his die roll the rating, the combat rating of one of his conquistadors. That conquistador is now at risk. He could die in combat. You must add a conquistador, but you don't necessarily have to add your best one. If you have artillery, you get a +1 to the die roll. And let's look here. Here we have it all. Artillery is +1, leader combat rating. Morale hits that you've taken give you a penalty. What you do is you total up your combat factors and you take the highest valued column that is not above your total strength. So if I had 32 strength points, I'd be on the 30 table. If I have 24, I'd be on the 24. Okay. Okay. In any given round of combat, each unit has to take 1 hit before any unit takes additional hits. What are the losses here? M's are morale hits, which are only going to affect the Spanish, and they're represented with those morale markers. Once you take a 5th one, bad things happen. If you get a number, that's the number of counters that the person rolling the dice, making the damage roll, gets to inflict on the enemy. But they can only inflict 1 on each counter until all counters have taken a hit in any given round. Cards can be used in this. Only 1 card of each type can be used in a combat. Yeah, it's specified for combat. Every combat lasts a minimum of 2 rounds. If encirclement is played, the combat lasts a minimum of 4 rounds. Now, after the combat is completed, as soon as the minimum number of rounds has been completed, Spanish forces, including their Indian allies, may retreat if they have an eligible adjacent space. We'll hit that on the retreat after combat. Indian forces will never retreat if they're on their own. At the conclusion of the combat, wow, a lot of glare on these glossy sheets. I hate glossy rolls. But it's what Compass provides nowadays. It's what almost everybody does. But the Compass ones are very glossy. Okay. You check for leader casualties. If all the Indians are eliminated and the king is there, he's captured. And he can be carried around with the expedition just like gold. Hopefully you're feeding him and giving him air, though. Not just hauling him around in a box. Maybe dunking him underwater. If a Spanish unit in battle is eliminated against an Indian force, the player's governor index will be dropped. If all units in an expedition are eliminated, then any Indians with that expedition are eliminated. Any gold with that expedition is lost. Now this is fucking weird, because if one conquistador attacks another, that appears to say that all that gold is just abandoned. That the losing side's gold is just abandoned, which I'm not sure I like. But any morale hit markers are removed. Yeah, well, there's nothing left. If the victorious force is all Indians, then any conquistadors with the defeated expedition are killed. If the victorious force includes Spaniards, then any remaining defeated conquistadors, if they survive the leader casualty roll, are captured. They can be ransomed back under any terms the players can work out, or they can be eaten. Executed. Okay. Leader casualties. I haven't done this yet. You roll 2 dice. On a 9 or a 10, the Conquistador is wounded. He's flipped over and cannot be activated for the rest of the game turn. On an 11 or 12, the Conquistador is dead. His expedition suffers a morale hit. You can use a Mano de Dios to try to save your own leader with a reroll. You can't throw a +2 on there, which wouldn't really be good anyway. If a Conquistador is killed, but not all his combat units are eliminated, he'll get one of these 5 Repel leaders. 5 may not be enough because it's possible for each player to have multiple expeditions, but it's unlikely that it's going to be insufficient. This also happens if you're killed by other means. If all Spanish units in battle are eliminated, any Conquistador with them is eliminated as well. Retreats. I haven't done a lot of combat, which is, I've fought some Indians, and that's it. Which is why I want to look at these more carefully than other rules. A force which elects to retreat from combat must adhere to the following restrictions. Attacking units, if they moved into the space in the same impulse, must retreat to the space they entered from. All other units must retreat if possible to a space which is discovered and is neither hostile nor allied with another player. In the case where the attacking units enter the space in the same impulse. This is weird because they don't enter at the same exact time. So I'm a little iffy on the existence of this rule. I might look in the errata to see online to see if I care enough. The defenders may not retreat to the space from which the attackers entered the battle. Yeah, that's not bad. I don't know if I'd need that entered a space in the same impulse, to tell you the truth. If a unit has no option but to retreat into an undiscovered space, it may do so, but it must retreat to the lowest level space available, and the retreating player gets a discovery in that space. They get to check discovery. A unit that has no option but to retreat into a space that's either hostile or allied can do so, but may not stop in that space. It continues retreating until it reaches a legal space and takes 1 morale hit for each of those spaces that it retreats through. Okay. We are going to pause here because my throat's beginning to go. My battery's beginning to go. But there isn't a whole lot left. It looks like there is. Like we're at the halfway point in the rules, but honestly, in terms of, I don't know, we'll see. Because there's a lot that I haven't glossed over well enough and might have to dig into. Okay. Plunder. Plunder is an action that you take, like movement, like diplomacy. You're sitting in a location, you say, I want to plunder this city. It has to be a city, or town, sorry. And there can't be any troops there. Now, I think if you declare a plunder action and there are troops, you get to fight them. But I'm not positive about that. I'd have to check again. Plunder is something I did not do. So I'm a little, there we go. So you look up the type of location it is, ranging through everything from town up to the imperial capital. There's modifiers here again. Hostage card allows you to get plunder more easily. The king captive in an imperial location. However, like I mentioned, I think before, you get these little plunder markers that are a continuing penalty. Again, like asking for money, just grabbing it. The natives tend to hide it. And you roll a die and get a modifier there. Now, in addition, you have to worry about the plunder exhaustion table, which again is pretty self-explanatory. You look at the type of city. Each plunder attempt that's already been marked will give you a -1 to the die roll. And eventually, if you plunder something too hard all at once, you get a plunder out, and it will not be allowed to be plundered for the rest of the game. Kind of a waste that these aren't back printed. There might have been something useful to put on the other side of that. I don't know, like a -3 plunder or something. The backs of the counters, in some cases, obviously, they're very much used, but in that particular case, I think that's really the only one where the back of the counter probably could have been used for something. These might be, but instead of +10s or anything like that, they chose to go with ×10s. I don't know how viable, how important it is to be able to exceed, 10 debt, well, 19 debt, but it's what they chose to go with, and it's certainly possible. So, all right. Now, like I said, at the subsistence phase, after all the impulses are done and the impulse roll fails, or the impulse continuation, well, the turn ends, you go to the subsistence phase. And here, each of your expeditions needs food, but there are some cases that give them free food if they're adjacent to an allied city or in it, or actually in one of the starting circles, Panama, Santiago. Or if you're at sea. While you're traveling at sea, you're being fed on board the boat. No matter how far you travel. To feed an and this can be a big deal because you could be sailing one expedition at sea and just leave it there because you got important things to do with another one, or because you want to play with natives or something. To feed your expedition, you have to expend 1 food point. Those food points will be present on or next to or whatever your conquistador to indicate which expedition has him. You only can give food, so 1 food point feeds your entire expedition, no matter what the size. You don't have to worry like you do in Source of the Nile about, well, a bigger expedition is going to take more food. No. I haven't gone into how much you carry in food. You can carry 3 food points with an expedition, but you need 1 infantry for each food point you carry. And then the total number of food that you can carry can be extended through assets, bearers and stuff like that. I don't know what they're called here. You have to feed an expedition if you can. You only get the food markers through diplomacy. Yeah, there's the carrying. You're allowed to give it to other players at any time as long as they're in the same space between expeditions. You could give it to your own players too between expeditions if you so desire. And payment can be done in pesos. Now this is something that kind of hit my head. Same with the splitting the treasury and whatnot. A lot is being abstracted here. That money is actually being transported back and everything. So again, Source of the Nile, you have to carry everything, any kind of wondrous things you find, or even just the knowledge that you have, comes back with your expedition. So your expedition has to survive and make its way back to a port for anything to count. Here, that's not the case. You're considered to be in some kind of communications. And this feels really weird, when you look at, I think it was Cortez who burned his boats. When you look at the attitude that was taken by some of the conquistadors in terms of not, trying to cut off any kind of communication path. But you can exchange pesos from your track automatically. And, I don't know, you're handing them a check or whatever, but it gets back. It doesn't end up missing or anything. You could also trade gold, in which case you just exchange gold markers with the expedition that you're buying food from. Or, you could just say, hey, we're buddies, especially if they're the same player. Starvation. So if an expedition gets no food, it takes starvation, which requires a morale check. If a unit is eliminated due to starvation, and that's if you take your 5th morale hit, We'll get to morale in a moment because I've got kind of a question there, but I think that it doesn't reset. There's no indication. If a unit is eliminated, the player's governor marker moves back one. Basically, there's certain bad things that happen to your expedition that your governor is going to look on you less favorably. Truth of the matter is that's probably not a reason they would arrest you, but you must feed your expedition if you can. Okay, you get morale hits sometimes from combat. If you retreat from combat, ooh, I missed that. Maybe I didn't. Oh yeah, when you retreat through spaces you can't retreat through. That's how. Okay. Or if a conquistador dies, or from a morale check. Now, you make morale checks when you're starving, during malaria check, which I believe is part of subsistence, and every time the oh no, malaria is, I guess, a card or something. We'll hit that in a while. Every time the expedition ends its move in a rainforest or desert space. I think malaria is a check. That happens very shortly. I thought it happened in subsistence, but I don't see it there. Yeah, I got it here. The way the malaria check works is if you're sitting on top of a mosquito space at the end of the turn, or in a rainforest space, you're going to get a malaria check. Rainforests always have mosquitoes. Okay. And you don't actually, rainforests and deserts and L's for legends, those spaces never, you never make a regular discovery check on. Now, the legend space, if there's a legend present there, you make a legend discovery check. But that's something different, to just see if you get the victory points for that. That's part of the standard game. We haven't gotten to it yet. Okay. -1 spaces, and again, I think these are supposed to be -1s, give you an additional penalty on your morale check. You make a roll on the morale check table. Again, something I haven't had to do. Modifications are indicated here. Malaria always causes a -1, but there's things that can negate the malaria penalty or make it easier overall. And in combat, you get an M, you get it. Okay. So on your morale check, you might just lose a unit, but you also get M results, which accumulate up. And once you have 4 morale hits, any additional morale hits you get, this is how I'm rolling it. I don't know if it's specific about that. Will cause the loss of a unit. Now, those units lost due to that are going to cause governor's favor track hits against them. If it happens through starvation or malaria. Now, if you lose units in combat, you also get a governor penalty. So, even if it's morale, I think. An expedition can attempt to remove morale hits by using the rally action. Again, this is an activation like movement. They say movement or combat, well, or diplomacy, or, you know, plunder or whatever. There's a whole series of things you can do. They're not all listed here. I could have listed them all down. But basically, it's anything you'd want to do. The rally action is using the rally table. The Conquistador has a rally value. The mosquito markers will give you a penalty. But if you divided gold in this particular impulse, now this is problematic, but remember, it sounds problematic, but it's not. Dividing gold is a free action. It doesn't cost you. So if you divide gold and rally, you get to get a bonus on here. You can spend an extra food point during the rally. Hey, throw a feast or whatever. But an enemy can play a disgruntled soldier's card at this point and cause you a penalty on this. You roll a die. Now here it says roll 2d6. I think that's the case. It looks correct. We'll see if the rules say differently. But it's possible that you get a worse result from it. But in general, you'll be removing morale hits because of this, as long as you have reasonable bonuses. Does it say? Yeah, so it says the following. Oh, here it says 2 dice. Yeah, okay. Okay, there's an ultimatum card, which has a chance of removing all of the morale checks, of the morale penalties. This is Pizarro's line in the sand, you know, either come with me and stop grumbling or turn around and leave. But you have a 50% chance of losing a combat unit from this. If you combine expeditions, they get the worst morale. And if you shift units from one expedition to the other, the worst morale happens in the expedition that that gains units. That is correct. It's worded differently here, but okay. Gold, you get gold through either diplomacy or plunder, or maybe other ways. It's kept on the expedition card. The expedition card, again, that is your Conquistador. There's no mats or anything for this. It could be useful, but who needs them? Gold points cannot voluntarily be transferred from one expedition to another. If one Spanish expedition attacks another and destroys its combat units, it captures any gold the expedition had. This is different from what I saw elsewhere, but it makes more sense. If an Indian force destroys a Spanish expedition, any gold with that expedition is lost. Yeah, so earlier it said if the last Spanish unit is destroyed, all the gold is lost. Yeah, this is the exception. Gold can remain indefinitely with an expedition, but is subject to certain hazards. Now, it says gold cannot be voluntarily transferred from one to another. Okay, but you can buy food with gold. So what? You know? You can't buy no food, I guess. And I would assume you couldn't trade a food for a food plus gold. It's not all specified there. In the basic game, whenever you want to, on your turn, you can exchange gold into victory points at a 1-for-1. And this is no big deal. It just logs you your victory points you get to block. In the standard game, that's going to go differently. And we'll get to that when we get to the standard game rules. I've already talked about dividing the gold, that it gets proportional. Okay. The governor. Everybody's going to have a governor index. It starts at 0. Your governor index decreases by 1 if you fight a battle against Indians and lose a Spanish combat unit. If multiple units are lost, the index just goes down by 1 for however many. And I think that can happen due to morale hits too in combat. The governor index also decreases by 1 if you lose a unit due to the 5th morale hit of a morale check. Yeah. Well, it says in a morale check. It almost sounds like there might be a hole here, but I don't think there is. You're losing the unit in combat due to morale. Printed in each box of the governor's favor track are 2 values, a recruitment and a victory point value. The recruiting modifier is added to the player's die roll for reinforcements funds. That's standard game only, and that's the modifier listed down here. The victory points is added to your victory points when you're checking victory. I don't know if you want to add it on the records track for victory points and then subtract it, or keep in mind that you have to look down here to see if there's a modifier. I never moved off 0, so in my couple of turns of play. When a faction's out of favor with the government, there are arrest warrant cards which can be used against the faction. An arrest warrant is played as an action during rounds. Player reveals it, designates a target. The target player must be out of favor with the governor at that time. The arrest warrant is placed face up in front of the affected player and remains as long as there's a warrant, as a warrant is in force. Now it says affected player, not conquistador. You're playing it against a faction, not, and that's what it says here, not a specific conquistador. While the warrant is in force, any player may attack forces of the target faction. That player can also attack other factions. The arrest warrant is removed when any conquistador of the target faction is killed or captured. The target player cancels it with a letter from the crown, or the target faction's governor index becomes positive. Okay, so this is important. You can only get it when you're negative, but you're going to have to go up at least 2 spaces to repair that situation. Now, an arrest warrant can be played in a different way against a player with 0 or positive governor index. In this case, it shifts the governor index back 1. This is like a suspicion type thing. A player can attempt to improve his governor index or reduce someone else's by giving gold to the governor. He can do this in any impulse, but can only make 1 gift per impulse. To give a gift, you deduct the number of gold points from any of your expeditions. You must spend at least 3. For every additional 3 spent, there's a die roll modifier of +1. You look at the governor gift table. Again, something I did not use. There we go. Looks like 2 dice. And the goal is either to increase your own index by 1 or to decrease an opponent's index by 1. Now, if you fail, I think no matter what, that is just going to reduce your own. It doesn't really, it says, note that a successful result can be used either to increase your index or reduce someone else's. I don't think you'd bonus someone by speaking badly about them. You just look worse. We're going to have to swap batteries here, and then we'll go to how the Indians work. If my last remaining space heater dies, I'm either going to have to move up here, which isn't bad because I have to keep the main part of the house at a certain temperature to avoid mold. And I've got I got a little heater here that works okay. You can get this area kind of warm, or down the basement, or buy another space heater. But, you know, I'm worried about the couple weeks in between or when I order it, because I never order things fast. And I may hope to get it on sale instead. All right. City is placed on the map when called for discovery. When a city is placed, it's friendly to all players. It becomes hostile as a result of the game actions. When it's hostile to all players. It can become friendly again due to diplomacy. However, wiping out the enemy troops doesn't make it friendly. It just makes it conquered, sort of. It's not a specific status. Indian units in a friendly city do not block expedition movement, but if the city becomes hostile, they do, and any expedition entering the city must cease movement there. A hostile city with no troops does not block movement. Okay. When an empire result comes up, let's find the right chart. Oh, what is going on? Which can only happen in level 4 areas. Sort of deeper inland, not necessarily higher mountains. You can see this is a lowland space. Most of them are more mountainous. And empire's pieces are placed when an empire result happens. The empire will be 3 things. And yes, I have to change these markers because they're invisible. Capital city. You know, it would be so useful if they did a color around the border that was different. But they made the king and the capital slightly different colors on each of these. And then the cities all have the same color around the border as the normal city, more or less. And maybe there's a difference, I can't tell. There is a little bit of different shading between them, but and I can kind of see the base cities versus the capitals, but it's not enough that it's playable. Okay. So when an empire shows up, you're going to put a city in the space that it shows up in. It may end up being the capital. This is a design limit. If all the empires are already in play, you will not generate more. These do not move and get dissolved. Imperial cities are always placed in level 4 spaces as follows. One city will be placed in the space where the discovery result happened. A second city will be placed in the nearest unoccupied level 4 space that's no more than 5 spaces away, counting distance through land connections only. Choose randomly in case of ties. And then a third will be put in the closest to either of the first two, again no more than 5, choosing randomly. Then you randomize which one's the capital city, and the king will go in the capital city. And yeah, it's really a shame about the difficulty to distinguish the pieces. And the other, these guys should have a back printing of some sort to tell you what is on the other side. And then the Conquistadors, the browns and reds, there's no way to tell which is which from the cards. You have to sort them individually. Just a bunch of little hassles, each of which I'm gonna mark, which maybe devalues my game, but fuck it, it's not like I sell them. And I certainly wouldn't sell this one. I'm a little iffy about it right now, but it's different enough that I wouldn't get rid of it. And I think it's applicable and kind of a fun type of thing that would work well in multiplayer. I'm telling you the review stuff already. We'll see. Okay. It's possible to have an empire that only has 2 cities if there's no other situation, if there's no other spaces that would qualify, but a 1-city empire result gets downgraded to a normal city. Once in place, the cities of the empire function the same as other cities, but they have some different columns and card options. And then they have the king, which goes in the capital city to begin with. The king can be captured through diplomacy or battle. This gives benefits on plunder or diplomacy. If a king is with a force that's eliminated in battle, he's captured by the victorious force. If he's with a force that loses its last unit from a non-battle causes, he's returned to the nearest city in his empire. The city cannot be Spanish occupied at the time. If no city is available because of that, the king is eliminated. A player may attempt diplomacy actions versus cities of an empire. A player may attempt diplomacy versus cities of the empire. There's a penalty for this. That's on the charts. Indian forces arrive at towns and cities, usually through card play. It can also happen if you plunder a city. In a city, when a city becomes hostile for any reason, even if the player decides to plunder it. In a city, when the city becomes allied with a player as a result of diplomacy, that is not mentioned in the diplomacy rules. In the diplomacy rules, it says the forces, if present, shift over. I'm going to go with this because otherwise it's going to be very hard to get troops from a city. Somebody will play them only to generate hostile attacks, pretty much. In a town or city, if a player uses an Indian uprising, this is the way, card on that space, these cards can even be used on spaces that already contain units. The additional units are drawn and added to those already there. In any space, if a player plays an Indian ambush in reaction to a player conducting discovery. There's no limit to the number of times troops can be drawn for any space. Indian troop units are drawn blindly from the cup. You draw 1 for a town, 2 for a non-imperial city, and 3 for an imperial city or capital. 2 units for any Indian ambush in an undiscovered space. For an Indian uprising, you draw 1 additional unit for each plunder attempt that's been made on this game turn. If the town has been plundered out, you draw 2 additional units. There wouldn't be a plunder marker, a number marker anymore there. Necessarily, so I don't know. Actually, there would be technically, so yeah, it could add up to a lot more. Once placed in a space, Indian troops remain there until either they're eliminated or the city becomes allied with a player, and then the troops will join an expedition. All right. So we're going here where if you ally with a city, it generates troops for you immediately, which you get to add to your expedition. How do you win the game? Well, you win the game from victory points converted from gold, and that might be through dispersal or through conversion in the basic game. You win the game by finding legends, and the first person who finds an empire gets 5 extra victory points, which seems like, wow, that's a big deal. And it really isn't, but it is an edge to whoever gets kind of the initiative, maybe not in the first turn of the game, it may be the second turn of the game. You have to kind of work your way to get to one of these spaces. So coming from here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, let's say you go here. Not a great space, but okay. Then it's going to take you, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 impulses to get to an empire. From here, it's 1, 2, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6. Up here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It looks like it's about 6 spaces minimum to get you to an imperial space. You might be able to cheat a little. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I don't know. But it looks like it's going to take you 6 impulses minimum, which you're probably not going to have. 6 impulses, you probably are going to end before you get that far. You might find it. Okay. And that's something to consider. I look here. This is 6. What about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's your 0 space. You stop there. So that's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, that's not going to get you any better. There's a lot of spaces down here, which is kind of appealing. I was kind of looking at, because the time I played, I ran into the Yucatan and coming out of Panama, and they kind of collided with each other, which was ugly, but those are the 2 easiest to get to on this map. And then on this map, you're kind of racing for that Venezuela-Colombia area up there. I don't know. Okay. Permanent victory points are recorded as they accrue. Gold still with an expedition doesn't count for victory. Only once it's been converted or divided. Now, at the end of each turn, there's a victory determination check, and you look to see if your total victory points plus any bonus points for cities that you have allied or controlled, governor favor, and deductions for debt are all taken into play. Now, there's no debt in the basic game. Is there a chart of all the victory point listings here? I don't think there is. That'd be kind of a useful thing. Legends can give you victory points too. I don't think they were noted here. Were they? Oh yeah, they were. All right. Okay, so you get points for imperial cities you control and for any type of city to which you're allied. If you have control, if you have an expedition there with at least 1 combat unit and no Indian or Spanish units belonging to another player occupy the space. You get 4 for each non-imperial allied city, 6 for each imperial city controlled or allied, and 8 for an imperial capital controlled or allied. Now, an allied imperial city is hard to determine. If you look, they have the hostile on them, but they use a different, you use a player marker for allied. Maybe you use both in the specific case of imperial stuff, just so you can distinguish the extra victory points for them. Okay. Note there's no points for controlling non-imperial cities, only points for alliances. And it's pretty easy to control cities. In the victory determination phase, you add your extra victory points and the governor marker, and you subtract debt. Now, that's going to be 2 victory points per point of debt. So debt costs twice as much as the victory point, as the money that you would disperse and turn to pesos that would remove that debt. The game is won by the first player to reach the required victory point total at the scenario. The game ends if any player meets it. If more than one has done so, the highest total wins. If there's a tie, you do a tiebreaker turn in which any player can win, not just the people who were in the lead at that time. It's kind of an interesting thing. As long as you can keep the value tied, the game could go on forever, but the game could go on forever anyway, just because nobody tries to get victory points. Okay. Basic setup, like I said, you start with forces already on the board. I'm not going to worry too much about how that works. And then on the second game turn, you're going to get an additional Conquistador, which you can place in. Standard game works very similarly. The victory in the basic game is going to be only 75 victory points. Now, for the standard game, you have this recruitment stuff, which I think I went into. But see, when I get to a point where I start looking in the rules, I just kind of keep going. So we look at the recruitment, and yeah, the cost of troops is here. You roll dice, get your initial funds. The only time you're using the initial setup table funds is on the first Conquistador you have, and there will not be any modifiers, so I don't know why it's got a 7 or plus. When you get funds off the recruitment table, and it's a one-time roll for each Conquistador. That's not specified in the rules, but it's also, there's no indication that it's not that way. And it's the only way that kind of works. So you can't sit around in port and keep rolling for more funds like you do in Source of the Nile. You're allowed to take up to the amount you rolled in additional funding, but you take debt on for that additional funding. Easier. Okay. Now, if you take additional funding, if you take any debt on, you're not allowed to have any pesos left over, I think. But otherwise, you're allowed to have pesos left over, which could fund your second expedition. Gold represents raw treasure. It is carried around with a faction and can be lost or stolen. It's of no use. Becomes valuable only when converted into pesos for spending. You can convert gold to pesos. It's a 1-to-1 exchange. You remove the gold points from the expedition and adjust the pesos marker. This can be done in any impulse, in addition to activation and card play. And it's a one-way conversion. You can't turn the pesos back into gold. Pesos don't help you with victory conditions, except that you can use them to offset your debt. Now, yeah, I don't think you're allowed to just buy additional troops without a new Conquistador coming in, which is a little odd. Your expedition is sort of there for, it's the Cortez burn your boats scenario here. It's just there. It's not going back to a capital and to a colony and generating more forces. So in debt, you get debt from taking out loans during recruitment. The amount of your debt is debt markers. You can pay it off at any time using pesos, 1-for-1. Your victory point total is reduced by double your debt. There's a creditor's demand payment card, which can be used against a player who has positive victory point total, and outstanding debt. The player must use any remaining pesos he has to pay off as much of his debt as possible. If he can't pay it off, then he reduces his victory point total by the amount of the outstanding debt. This reduction is permanent. The player then sets the debt back to 0. This is not a good deal for the person playing the card, right? Because basically all you're doing is you're forcing them to exchange their debt at a 1-for-1 You use pesos to pay off, then you reduce permanent victory point by the amount of the debt. Yeah, you're forcing them to reduce their debt at a 1-for-1 from gold. Something they can do at any time, but they've chosen not to. But their current victory point penalty is 2-for-1. I don't know why you would ever play this, except maybe to wipe out their existing pesos. If they've somehow stockpiled some money in order to do something. Hold on. Somebody walking by, and it's dark enough that that's an odd occurrence, so I don't know. I'm becoming that cranky old person who peers out the windows. What are they doing out there? Okay. Other special stuff from the standard game. Standard game combat has some special rules. Horse units. When an expedition with horse units fights an all-Indian force, you get a bonus extra attack round where only the horse units get to roll their dice. And they'll still get to roll their dice again when both sides get to fight. A unit consisting only of horse units may retreat after just one round of combat at the player's option, unless either a card prevents this or they're fighting a Spanish force that also has horse units. Now, this doesn't work with ambushes, though. You can't do the special horse attack, if I recall correctly. That may be specified on the card rather than here, because I don't see it there. Sudden shock attack. This is a special type of combat. You can use this whenever you're attacking only Indians. It's taking place in an imperial city or capital. There's at least one artillery unit and 2 horse units in the attack. You probably want to set up so that you have that. The force is commanded by a leader with a combat rating greater than 0. Many of the Conquistadors qualify. No sudden shock attack has yet been done against this empire in the game. There's nothing that allows you to mark that, so you're going to have to write that down or remember. To resolve the attack, you roll 2 dice. You need to roll a 9 or better without any modifiers. You can use the Mano de Dios cards to re-roll, but not to modify. And remember, you can only use 1 re-roll on any particular die roll. If the attack succeeds, all the Indians in the space are eliminated. If the king is present, he's captured, and the Spanish take no losses. If the attack fails, the Indians suffer no losses, and then you go into combat, but in the first 2 battle rounds, only horses and cannon take part. In the first battle round, the Indians get +1 to their die roll, and after that, the combat proceeds as normal. Sudden shock can only be used once per Indian empire. Once it's used, you can't use it against that empire for the rest of the game. And it would be kind of neat if there was some way to mark that. The king marker has nothing on its other side. Would be a use for that, but whatever. We're running out of both battery and that thing's still charging. So we'll keep pushing on. Division of gold. So instead of just converting gold into victory points like in the basic game, here you have to go through a special mechanism to convert for victory points. You declare a division of gold in addition to your normal actions and card play. And I think you can do things with different, you can activate one group but divide gold with another, because dividing gold doesn't cost you anything. However, you probably want to do a rally when you divide gold if you have any morale hits. And this will be in a specific space and may include some or all of the gold that they're carrying. You don't have to commit it all. which is important because the division might end up not even. Once gold turns into victory points, you can't turn it back into anything else. So you total the amount of gold points. 1/5 of that amount, rounded up, goes to the king. It's just gone. 3 points for each conquistador other than the expedition leader is expended from that. 1 point for every 4-foot or cannon units, and 1 point for every 2 horse units, rounding fractions up, is expended. Whatever is left at 1 victory point per gold point goes into your victory point total. So you want to hold your gold as long as possible, more or less, because the size of your expedition subtracts a fixed amount from it. The 1/5 to the king, you want to kind of balance that out so you lose an even amount there, preferably. And, you know, so you're going to be playing around with stuff with that. And all the divided gold markers get removed from play. You need to be able to satisfy steps 2, 3, and 4. The 5th, the points for additional conquistadors, and the points for the foot or cannon units in the space to divide gold. So you can't just say, oh, I'm dividing gold with 1, which is important because there's a morale bonus in the rally check for dividing gold. And then they give an example of how that works. Legends. So there are legend markers, which I have not popped out yet. Up here. Looks like there's only 6. 2 of them are rivers, the Amazon and the Mississippi. Those are limited to the appropriate map. The other 4 can go on either map. Legends are information about where the legend can be located. Everybody kind of knows about it. Basically, the legend marker goes on the map, on that space, and now you can go hunt it if you wish. You don't have to. In the old Berg Conquistador game, when you got one of these, it was just a penalty. You had to go do something. And you got nothing out of it. It was just this horrible thing that happened to your conquistadors. Okay. So these can show up due to random events, or there are strategy cards for each legend that allow a player to place a legend where they want to put it, if they want to put it near themselves to hunt it down. Now, when I was playing, one guy had a handful of legends, which is probably a horrible hand, and he should have dumped some of them off. He started, instead of starting his second expedition with his first one to reinforce it, he started his second expedition up here with a hope of eventually moving over and hunting a legend. But he kept using his first one, never really used his second one. It didn't work out as a great plan. Okay. There are events that can move legends. And if a move legend happens and there's no legend in play, it's treated as a new legend event. Now, the new legend procedure, you randomly choose the map, and then you randomly choose the space. So the player who rolls it, who has the initiative, whatever, doesn't get any kind of special bonus off of that. The strategy deck has 1 card for each legend. On playing the card, you choose which map the legend is going to go on, and you can put it in any space, at least 3 spaces away from any expedition, and in which no legend has been found up to that point in the game. A card can be played only for a legend marker which is not already on the map. You can hold a card hoping that it gets removed, because that is possible. When an expedition enters a space containing a legend marker, you don't do normal discovery tables. Instead, you use the legend table to determine the result. And each legend has its own special cases. You roll dice on the legend player. Other players can play cards first, as they would with a normal discovery attempt. Assume you can play cards too. Some of these results cause the legend to be removed from play permanently. Others cause it to remain on the map in its present location and be discovered again. This applies to the two rivers. Others caused it to be removed from the map and returned to the pool so it can be reused by cards. But some of them are going to give you a result. And they can give you a huge amount of victory points by finding that. Like enough to get you a big hunk of the victory. Now remember, the basic game was 75 victory points. This one's going to be 200, which is going to be a longer game. You don't have to play that full amount. You could set it at a lower value. Okay. Random events. You roll the random events, and really, it's a random events table. Shit happens, right? Legends might be moved or appear or whatever. Malaria. During Subsistence, okay, so this is why malaria is separate. It's a standard game rule, not basic. I'm so disturbed by that basic standard as opposed to basic advanced. Just, one gets used to something. During Subsistence, if you're in a rainforest or a space with a mosquito, you have to roll a die for malaria. You roll a die and check the starvation and malaria table. Isn't that just a morale check? I think that's just a morale check. Yeah. If you look on the morale check table, it has the modifiers they're talking about. This is an error. So yeah, you have a -1 for rolling starvation in certain spaces, -1 for any malaria roll, but there's other modifiers to it. So you make a morale check. If an expedition has no food and is also in mosquito or rainforest, they have to check for both conditions, which could cause a lot of effects. Okay, I'm going to swap batteries again and go over the standard game rules, and then maybe I'll glance at the solitaire rules, but basically it's just a mechanism for making the cards play against you, just like another player would. And really it's the main way another player is going to interfere with you. The standard game actually starts in a similar fashion to the basic game. The difference is instead of starting right on the board, you're going to start in one of the key locations. So you grab all these Conquistador cards, which again, they're not marked, so there's no way to know what they are. They're all the cards for red printed Conquistadors. You have to sort them ahead of time. Set all the replacement Conquistadors aside until they're required. The replacements are only because you have no Conquistador and your last one dies with an expedition. The brown printed Conquistadors are put in a separate pile face down. They will be used as needed. And they'll be, on turn 3, all these additional Conquistadors get shuffled back into, with the discards, into the strategy deck. So at that point you can get reinforcements kind of at random. And they're kind of a pretty nice reinforcement, to tell you the truth. Okay. Then you undergo that, acquire funds, purchase units. You're limited to 3 horse, take out debt, whatever. There's a quick start option that gives you more of a basic game type play at the beginning. At the start of the second player turn, you choose an additional Conquistador. Choice goes in the reverse of the initial order. If there's 4 fewer players, you choose from the red printed Conquistadors. If they're additional, you can use any of the red or brown. This Conquistador, I'm not sure. I mean, I think the browns are weaker, but maybe there's some slight advantage for the last player in order to be able to pick brown, the best brown one. That may be better than the worst red ones. This Conquistador can enter play with an existing expedition or in Cuba or at Panama, either of the Panama. And you go through the full recruiting, even if they start with an old conquistador, with an old expedition. So that's probably your best option, is to combine your expeditions right away. Unless you have something special in mind, like I did with trying to go after legends with my second one. You can decline an additional conquistador at this time if you prefer. I can't think of a reason you'd want to do that. At the start of the third game turn, you shuffle all the red and brown ones into the deck. And then they arrive during card draw, and they will come using the same kind of procedure where they get funding, etc. This also allows you to add players later in the game. You pull out the conquistadors out of the deck, I guess, and they can pick one or two, depending on when they come, using initial setup for the first one. I don't know how likely, a situation that is. It also, if they're coming in fairly late, it can be a serious hindrance to the game, to their position in the game, but, they were late, man. Victory in this, remember, debt's included as a penalty for this. The victory point total is 200. They suggest at least 50. I guess you could modify the basic game one. All right, for the Solitaire game, which I am not going to be playing, you play one deck. The strategy deck is divided into 3 decks. One is going to be all the reaction and combat cards. The enemy action deck is going to be all the stuff that kind of fucks with you. And then the regular action deck is cards that help you. Each deck is reshuffled whenever it's exhausted and can be reshuffled any number of times. It's not mentioned in the base game. I'm assuming you reshuffle. At least I don't remember it being so. You use conquistadors who are appropriate to where they did their discoveries. You can select any 3 conquistadors at start, or, there are other options like randomize a couple of them. You could randomize all of them if you really wanted to make life hard on yourself. The 3 conquistadors are on the board as a single expedition. If using the North map, you use Santiago de Cuba or Panama, otherwise Panama. You roll for initial funds and buy troops as in the standard game. If you can go into debt. And the sequence of play changes a little bit. You can discard your cards. You draw a new hand and discard just like in standard. You can use random events or not, depending on how you want to play. Then you hit action impulses just like in standard game. Now, for enemy actions, you draw up to 2 cards from the enemy action deck. You draw 1 card if there's a village or town in play, 2 cards if there's a city. This is total. Any applicable card is resolved immediately. If it can't be applied, you discard it. If it calls for an attack on the Spanish player, any face-up combat cards are added to this attack if possible. Conduct movement and or actions with 1 expedition. Or 2 if you play Buena Suerte a Ambos. I don't know what the hell that is. These are conducted as in the standard game, except for a reaction when you move into or undertake a certain actions in undiscovered spaces. If any cards drawn are conquistadors, they may be retained and brought into play as in the standard game. I think that is not the enemy action card. Okay. Cards from the enemy action deck are applied immediately. If not immediately applicable, they're discarded. There's rules for each one. Basically, you'll be playing them as if you're an opponent playing them against you. There might be some indications of how you would handle that. Each time you move an expedition into an undiscovered level 1 or higher space, you conduct combat, plunder, or diplomacy in such a space. You draw cards from the reaction deck, depending on the level of the space. Any cards that are applicable, you use. If they're not, you don't. If combat cards are drawn from the reaction deck but cannot be used, they're placed face up, and there'll be a future penalty awaiting you for your next combat, which could be an interesting, you could have some interesting decision making based on what you're going to be facing. You can't do anything to change it. And then you play 10 game turns and determine your victory based on how well you do in that period of time. That's going to be fairly quick. 10 turns by one player. Yeah, you've got some extra decks to fiddle around with and whatnot. I suspect the actual game is going to take more than 10 turns. Going to be tracking turns on this track. There's supposedly a game turn record marker. It doesn't actually exist. Again, what I found most interesting was, again, those design notes. I want to touch on that a little bit more because I kind of made it sound like it was games that triggered me into my own thinking about something vaguely similar to this. Not obviously the kind of games that I start thinking about are way too overblown for this kind of, this looks like an easily playable game. But it wasn't really. Those games were in the back of my head. I had probably played Age of Exploration relatively recently, but it was actually reading a book, where I was reading a book about the Cortez expedition that, it just is such a captivating story, and I'm sure the equivalent story on Pizarro is, but I know less about that. But man, it's just it seems so unlikely that this could have happened, But for it to happen twice, it's just there's something baked in there that's almost astounding when you think about it. Battery is dying. This is going up. I'll be playing in a little while.